This is the Revolutionary Women in the Underground and Beyond panel. And I'm just going to briefly introduce the three speakers, and then they will come up and give their papers. So the first speaker will be Choonib Lee, who is a doctoral candidate in history at Stony Brook University. And her dissertation, which her paper is a short excerpt, is titled Fashioning Revolutionary Women, Women in the Black Panther Party, the Weather Underground, and in Radical Feminism. The next speaker, and they're sitting in order, so you can follow along, is Mary Phillips, who is an assistant professor of African and African American Studies at Lehman College, which is in the city at CUNY. And her paper is also coming from her forthcoming book manuscript, Black Power Feminism in the Black Panther Party. And then our third speaker is Sarah Seidman, who's a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for the US and the Cold War at NYU, and also a visiting scholar in the history department at NYU. Her dissertation, Vencemos, I know I just said that very badly, I'm sorry. Vencemos means we shall overcome the African-American freedom struggle and the Cuban Revolution. That's her dissertation title, and she got her PhD in American Studies from Brown University. So please welcome Choonib Lee.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hesford. I'm going to just start my presentation.
Speak into the microphone, Choonib.
Hello? Can you hear better? Thank you. On October 9th, 1969, about 70 women from the Weathermen, an extremist sect of the Student for a Democratic Society, or SDS, gathered at Grant Park in Chicago to march toward the city's Armed Forces Induction Center. The women's militia, including its leader, Bernardine Doran, planned to shut down the draft board office as an anti-war demonstration, wearing helmets, leather jackets, heavy gloves, and carrying Vietcong flags. A few women were even holding wooden sticks and pipes. At the park, Doran differentiated the Weather Women's action from the actions of the newly emerging feminists, saying, "We are not picketing in front of bra factories now," reminding the public about the anti-Miss America pageant protesters in the previous year called bra burners by the media. The Weather Women called for women's strength and courage as revolutionaries fighting against racism, imperialism, and sexism. The Weather Women's militancy and violent approach, however, evoked bitter critique from many feminists who felt that the Weather Women's violent activism for making a revolution disturbed the women's liberation movement. On the contrary, the Weather Women believed their violent activism was leading toward both domestic and international women's liberation. In this paper, I will examine what women's liberation meant for Weather women during the Vietnam War era, and how their theories and beliefs led to a different approach than many feminist groups for women's liberation. I will argue that women in revolutionary movements, such as the Weathermen, practiced their own version of women's liberation, and although revolutionary women have been marginalized in the history of the women's movement, their commitment and contributions to women's liberation were significant and deserve to be included in feminist scholarship with new perspectives. Having endured years of sexist political oppression in the New Left and civil rights movements, many young activist women left those groups in the late 1960s in order to build their own independent movement for women's liberation, such as radical and socialist feminists. However, there were also many women who stayed in the movements, working for anti-racism, anti-imperialism, like the women in the Weathermen. During the escalation of US violence in the Vietnam War, and subsequent resistance movements throughout the United States, many activists, especially SDS women, were more involved in the militant and aggressive unit of the group. Militancy and violence as a means to an end of racism and imperialism appealed to those women who had been working for justice for a long time and who were now looking for a revolution in the United States. SDS member and leader Kathy Wilkerson records that the toughness and aggressiveness of militant male members had its appeal to women who were exploring their own independence and strength. For whether women like Wilkerson, this macho-style activism was attractive because it made women feel more powerful, debunking conventional ideas about women's passivity along with socialist ideas. On the contrary, young white radical feminists abhorred any association of their movement for women's liberation with violence, which was perceived as misguided and male-identified. For them, the women's liberation movement was a different style of activism, distinctively for women, particularly American women, and purposefully pacifistic. Perpetual mockery by men and women within the New Left and civil rights movements was also a primary motivator for feminist separatism and disassociation from other forms of activism. Many male members of the Weathermen, similar to those in the SDS, frequently ridiculed women's issues consistent with the sexist attitudes of the time. Despite this, some SDS activist women made a final attempt to collaborate with their male counterparts. During a demonstration in 1969, Marilyn Saltzman Webb, a founding member and longtime SDS activist, gave a speech on women's liberation, but her speech was drowned out by jeering and catcalling from many SDS men, including such vulgar comments as, "Take her off the stage and fuck her." Following the incident, Webb received an anonymous phone call from some SDS women threatening her never to speak for women's liberation in an SDS meeting again. At that time, the Weather women, especially Kathy Wilkerson, were accused as the anonymous callers and thus were perceived as being anti-feminist. Finally, Webb decided to leave the SDS and New Left as a whole and founded an independent women's liberation group in Washington, D.C. Many feminists also adamantly opposed whether women's associations with violent activism, such as bombings, which feminists labeled as machismo, masculine, and male-identified. Radical feminist Robin Morgan openly criticized the Weather women's masculine style and gratuitous violence, saying it was only a ploy for male approval. After the media misleadingly labeled the Miss America protesters as bra burners to vilify women's political activism, when in fact no bras were ever burned, Morgan was quick to point out the media's misconception, insisting that the protesters did not engage in any violent or unlawful actions, and subsequently differentiating the feminist movements from other movements of violence, like male activists who burned their draft cards. Jane Elpert, a former armed underground activist who ultimately converted to radical feminism, sent an open letter to the Weather women called Mother Rights, which ignited new debates on women in violent activism in 1973. Elpert supported the assumption that women's violence was the result of being brainwashed by men. Both Morgan and Elpert represented and promoted an anti-male and separatist movement because they thought of men as the enemy and wanted to focus instead on the assets and strength of women from an essentialist viewpoint, arguing that whether women's masculinity went against women's inherently anti-violent nature. Contrary to the popular conception of the weatherman as a male-dominated group, in reality, 3/4 of the weatherman members were women by 1970. Women's leadership roles within the group were particularly crucial in both determining the weatherman's gender politics and the weather women's development of the women's movement. Whether women were responsible for many of the group's political actions, and many became iconic public representatives of the movement, especially Bernardine Dohrn. Dohrn was a national secretary of the SDS and the most outstanding leader in the weatherman. Her prominent position as a leader influenced and reflected women's more significant and powerful roles in the weatherman, beyond the stereotypes of activist women who were mainly secondary and only supporting male members. Kathy Wilkerson believed that Bernardine's unique place at the top encouraged women like herself to become leaders and exhibit women's own power. Counter to radical feminist anti-elitist policy, the weather women like both Dohrn and Wilkerson were breaking down gender stereotypes by holding these leadership roles, going against the convention that women were not powerful or strong or even smart enough to have positions of power in political movements. Whether women's leaderships and empowerment as political subjects were further signified by their self-representation as revolutionaries rather than feminists. The weather women's style, which I will refer to as revolutionary chic, originated from the example of the powerful image of a Black Panther women holding a shotgun and of Vietnamese women holding guns in their hands while carrying babies on their backs. The iconographies of revolutionary women allowed weather women to associate with women's liberation to become revolutionaries, rejecting the traditional character of women and the dichotomy between masculinity and femininity, giving women access to men's realm of power and aggression and expanding to more inclusive political subjectivity with both gender and race. At the very time when feminists were arguing that women should stop serving others and organize instead around their own oppression, the weather women were urging radicals to secure guns so they could serve in the white auxiliary of the Black and Third World liberation struggle. An example of the revolutionary chic look can be seen in this 1969 photograph of Dohrn by Richard Avedon. You can see her trademark, the miniskirt, high boots, and leather jacket, which represented the fashion of a revolutionary woman in the late 1960s, iconic signs of her military associations, and her support of the working class people, the Black Panther Party, and the Third World liberation. The revolutionary chic look was not exclusive to Dohrn. Most weather women also donned the style. Many leftist women, especially other weather women, admired the militant style of Dohrn's fashion and her strength as a role model for all political women. Kathy Wilkerson said she enjoyed wearing the leather jacket, jeans, and boots because they were fashionable and macho posturing. As she recalled, that style of clothing symbolized a pride of fearlessness, of her willingness to try new things and endure discomfort and hardship. And the outfit's toughness was an ultimate rejection of the image of feminine helplessness, a way of liberating themselves from the ideal images of American women. For the weather women like Doran and Wilkerson, along with other militant female activists, their fashion shaped their gender and political identity. They clearly gave up dressing like ladies, trading in combed hair, modest skirts, and heels for minis and combat boots, and applied consumer culture to do their political work, which was not related to traditional domestic women's work. Rejecting traditional gender roles in terms of fashion and reproducing the powerful images and behaviors of men was the weather women's way of becoming revolutionary women, while at the same time fulfilling women's liberation. To combat the predominance of male chauvinism and supremacy in both American society and its social movements, weather women and radical and socialist feminists each struggled with finding the best approach for their own circumstances. According to the article Inside the Weather Machine, published in 1970, weather women believed that women's liberation would be achieved by starting a revolution, not only political but also personal transformation as well, rejecting bourgeois lifestyles and working as full-time revolutionaries. For weather women, becoming revolutionary women meant debunking the myth of exceptional political woman and encouraging women to become political leaders. However, some socialist feminist groups, such as Bread and Roses, disagreed with the weather women's strategy of revolution first and then women's liberation, despite their shared anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist ideas. They maintained that, quote, women must make revolutions for themselves as well as for other people, unquote. Bread and Roses did not demonstrate anti-male ideas like Morgan and Alpert. However, they still refused weather women's masculine rhetoric and actions. Weather women's political subjectivity was also a result of the realization of white women's position as the oppressors as well as the oppressed. Weather women stressed their struggle against their own oppression of the Third World, emphasizing the importance of fighting against their own identity as white American women, as opposed to feminists who focused on white women's internal oppression. The weather women's idea of women's liberation was international, in other words, third worldism. Since white women in the United States were the oppressors for African Americans and the third world, they could not be liberated if African Americans and third world countries were not free from American imperialism. This was why weather women urged women to, quote, pick up the gun and kill the pig. Our liberation depends on this fight, as well as seeing this fight as part of a worldwide struggle with all the people of the world, unquote. The consciousness of white American women's double bind transformed weather women's white femininity, so-called white skin privilege, into revolutionaries, discarding their racist and imperialist womanhood. In Honky Tonk Women, circulated by Weatherman in 1969, the group revealed its national principle position on women's liberation. The Weather Women insisted that women's liberation would be achieved by national liberation, quote, for national identity, for self-determination, unquote. In the Weatherman's view, Vietnamese women fighting against US imperialism were also fighting for women's equality by picking up the gun. Although Weatherman limited women's position to that of fighters, it also shows its feminist analysis that women's liberation was deeply related to, quote, a false consciousness of what women should be, making and keeping women weak, by defining what women should look like, how women should act, and how women should think and feel, unquote. The idea of becoming revolutionaries allowed women to be less passive, less dependent, and less inferior. If feminists differentiated women's femininity from masculine characteristics, considered male chauvinism as the fundamental source of women's secondary status and subordination, and separated themselves from men in order to organize women's independence, the Weather Women's theory went in different direction, although they also considered male chauvinism to be repressive for women. Weather Women emphasized that women's own passivity and dependency on men were also a form of chauvinism, so that women's liberation could not be accomplished without women becoming active, strong, self-reliant, and self-confident as revolutionaries with new lifestyle in a new society. For white women of American nationality, breaking their own identity through violence was a way to prove their devotion to the fight against imperialism and racism, and thus achieve their own liberation. Despite the often antagonistic relationship between revolutionary women and so-called second-wave feminists, they shared the core concept of women's liberation against male chauvinism and gender inequality. Whether women developed a revolutionary women's style through their leaderships, revolutionary chic fashion, and armed activism. Thus, whether women invented a political subjectivity, strong and masculine, but neutralized and more inclusive through violence. Thank you.
Good afternoon. In this talk today, I will highlight Black Panther Party member Ericka Huggins' voice by drawing on interviews I conducted with her. I highlight the intersections of Black power and Black feminist politics and uncover the existence of a Black feminist theory and practice in the Black Panther Party, which I identify as Black power feminism. I use the term Black power feminism as a conceptual framework to discuss the leadership of women in the Black Panther Party and some men in my larger project. On the front cover of the Saturday, July 12, 1969 issue of the Black Panther Party newspaper, an enlarged picture of a mother and child depicts them in a rat-infested apartment. The picture shows a mother with a loaded rifle pointing a hole in the wall to kill rats as they enter her apartment. The significance of the picture represents a mother staving off danger against her home. The image speaks to the historical legacy of Black women's activism from slavery to freedom and disrupts the notion that self-defense was reserved only for men. Often, women worked as militant radical activists, upholding the beliefs of armed self-defense. The leadership of women, including Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, Amy Jacques Garvey, Rosa Parks, Gloria Richardson, and Mabel Williams, influenced radical female activists of the late 1960s and early 1970s. These women laid the foundation for Black women's activism in the Black Panther Party. The staff of the party's famed publication chose Minister of Culture Emory Douglas's political artwork as the front cover of this newspaper during a critical time when the members discussed the complexities of gender politics. Previously a stance traditionally assigned to men, the mother in this case fulfills the role as protector of the entire family, which includes not only the children, but the father as well, and challenges women merely as complementary to men. Women found refuge in the Black Panther Party because they wanted to serve the community in a very practical way. Women played an integral role to its operation and daily functioning. Ericka Huggins, in particular, was born on January 5, 1948 in Washington, D.C., in a very working-class family. As a graduate of Lincoln University, her attendance at the March on Washington, and going to school in a hostile environment, she made a vow that she would serve people for the rest of her life, and joined the Black Panther Party with her lover, John Huggins. Over time, the FBI's COINTELPRO program targeted Ericka, among many others. As a result, her lover, John Huggins, and Bunchy Carter, leader in the LA chapter, were murdered in a carefully orchestrated plot on January 17, 1969. With the request of the Black community, she opened the Yale New Haven chapter of the Black Panther Party after his death. However, 3 months later, police arrested her and Chairman Bobby Seale for conspiracy with the intent to commit murder for the death of a party member. Stories about Ericka Huggins and the New Haven 14 often appeared in the Panther newspaper. She was isolated as a result of her status as a political prisoner. These prisoners, in particular political prisoners, receive harsher, punitive measures as part of their sentencing to keep them isolated from the community. As a survival strategy in prison, she meditated and wrote poetry. She was placed in a mainstream prison population. She established the Sister Love Collective when she was placed in the larger mainstream population with other women to assist newly admitted female prisoners. In addition, they use hair as a space to build a tight-knit community. She awaited trial for almost 2 years before the state dropped the charges in 1971. When she was released, her daughter was 2.5 years old. Ericka's incarceration became a critical component in the evolution of gender politics in the Black Panther Party and sent a direct message that women fought for revolution alongside their male comrades. In Panther Sisters on Women's Liberation, a pamphlet distributed to party members, one woman wrote, quote, "The brothers had to look on Ericka with a new light because she had been through a lot of the things that some brothers hadn't even been through. The sisters looked up to her, and we all saw what we had to do. The sisters have to pick up the guns just like the brothers. There are a lot of things the sisters can do to change society," end quote. Ericka's resistance strategies in prison situated her as an icon for women in the Black Panther Party. Despite the governmental assaults, she demanded her own humanity. Black power as a theory declared a strong sense of self-pride, a validation of Blackness, and a critical assessment of the realities of the oppressed people in the United States and around the world. Black feminism is a political movement that challenges the interlocking oppressions of Black women and women of color. It disrupts systems of patriarchy and works to end male chauvinism. Black feminism is not divisive. It does not draw divisions between men and women, but calls for unity in eradicating oppressive forces that are damaging to the community. Although some women in the Black Panther Party demonstrated more boldly and directly a feminist consciousness in their daily activities than other women in the organization, there did exist a flexible overall engagement with gender that constantly transformed. Due largely to the racism inherent in the women's liberation movement, party women disassociated themselves from nominal feminism. Women's liberation in the mainstream served the needs and interests of middle-class white women. The racism and white privilege practiced among some of the most visible feminist leaders, as well as the sexism in the Black Power movement, isolated many Black women. Party women did not identify with the current feminist movement. However, according to Ericka, women in the party engaged feminism. She asserted, quote, "We were feminists. We did all kinds of things to break down barriers within the Black Panther Party, gender barriers. I would take issue with my own comrades and women in the Black Panther Party. I would ask them, what do you mean you are not a feminist? You absolutely are a feminist. You joined the Black Panther Party. You could not be in the Black Panther Party if you were not a feminist," end quote. While she did not use this term feminist during her tenure in the Black Panther Party, she believed in the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes. In my discussions with her, she declared, quote, "Yes, I'm a feminist, always have been. Every member of the Black Panther Party, woman or man, if they were awake, had a feminist perspective," end quote. She recognized feminism as spiritual maturity. Spiritual maturity, as she refers to it, is the idea that a person constantly challenges the way in which white, patriarchal, mainstream society has socialized them to dismiss the concerns of women. She stated, quote, "Feminism is a humane approach to living on earth. A person who is spiritually mature advocates and helps to realize the economic, political, and social equality of the sexes," and she said male, female, and intersex, end quote. It is often not recognized that the Black Panther Party formed coalitions and support networks with women of color feminist organizations. As Huggins noted, quote, "Women in the Black Panther Party work with all kinds of women's organizations because the Black Panther Party was a coalition building organization, which is how it got the name the vanguard of the movement," end quote. Specifically, the Black Panther Party worked with women in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was having similar discussions on women and politics of gender. According to Ericka, in 1978, the Black Panther Party worked with the Third World Women's Alliance, whose roots stem from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to form a coalition to fight infant mortality in Oakland, California. To address equality for women, the Black Panther Party created a coalition with staff and parents of the Oakland Community School and community members to fight infant mortality and the poor treatment many low-income women and families experience in the obstetrics and gynecology department at Highland Hospital. The staff kept patients and families in the waiting room for a long period of time, while some women suffered from contractions and even went into labor. To bring attention to this problem, they attended the county supervisors' meetings to address these health inequalities. They shared the fight against infant mortality with the party, and the Third World Women's Alliance represented a link with feminist organizations and a commitment to the liberation struggle. This relationship promoted discussions of gender within and across groups over the correct approach among party members and Black feminists in same-sex groups. Despite differences between the Third World Women's Alliance, because there were some differences, and the Black Panther Party, they formed a coalition based on their shared interests and commonalities, in which case they did not have an antagonistic relationship, but exhibited Black power through a feminist-centered perspective. As an armed Black radical political organization that served Black and poor communities, the Black Panther Party experienced high levels of governmental repression and violence on a daily basis. The hard work of many women in the community deprived them of the luxury to debate and write about theory. Ericka commented, quote, "We didn't have time to write. We had given our lives. We thought we were gonna die. Every single one of us. That's how we were living," end quote. Some women in the party did not, in fact, agree with feminism, but had a different approach to it. As women organizing alongside men in the Black Panther Party, it meant something different. Black power feminism not only challenged ideas surrounding male chauvinism, but also required a refashioning of Black power politics that valued the concerns and needs of Black women as equal comrades in the party. Black power feminism bridges Black feminism and Black liberation theories. It recognizes Black power as intricately linked to Black feminism. This body of thought challenges dominant perceptions of Black power and Black feminism as oppositional and mutually exclusive. It allows us to begin to analyze the relationship between Black feminism and Black power in more complex and nuanced ways, and rescues Black power from its hypermasculine and patriarchal dominant narrative, and repositions women as pivotal to the movement. Specifically, from 1968 until 1969, women's membership increased in the Black Panther Party. Greater participation by women prompted internal discussions on male chauvinism and sexism in the party. Women's vocal protest against male chauvinism advanced the party's position in relation to gender. Over time, the Black Panther Party became very progressive in relation to gender politics, correcting the way in which scholars historicize Black power and the Black Panther Party. In my work, I place women central as theoreticians and leaders. As a member in the party, Ericka Huggins believed in the liberation of all oppressed people, and that included women. She centered her theoretical understanding of Black power on feminism through her participation in the party and progressive articulations of gender. She put into practice Black power feminist politics in intentional and conscious ways on behalf of the progression of women in the Black liberation struggle. Analyzing the impact of Ericka's leadership on gender politics provides a window into the experiences of women in the Black Panther Party, illustrating the direct connections between Black power politics and Black feminism. Her feminist leanings influence the direction of the party and serve as an example of a larger progressive gender politics in the Black Panther Party. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this all right? Okay. So, today I'll talk briefly about the encounters between the scholar and activist Angela Davis and Cuba in the late 1960s and 1970s, specifically about her reception in Cuban culture during her imprisonment and trial, and her experiences on the island after her acquittal. This is a piece of my larger book project on African-American connections with the Cuban Revolution. The women's liberation movement in the United States isn't at the center of the project, so I've been particularly eager to soak in as much as I can during the conference. This piece does speak to themes that have come up repeatedly over the last few days, though, including both the intersectionality of Black feminism and the global scope of women's liberation in the 1960s and 70s. And I look forward to continuing the discussion of those themes. In 1970, the Cuban graphic artist Alfredo Roscard designed a poster of activist intellectual Angela Davis that set her free. The black and white poster represented Davis as a drawn figure facing the viewer, wearing sunglasses, a long dress, the natural hairdo for which she became known, and handcuffs, so the image above. Davis still languished in jail, awaiting trial on the trumped-up charges of murder and conspiracy for her alleged involvement in a notorious shootout in a California courtroom. But the image illustrating her arms bound in front of her body showed another imagined set of arms that rose up above her head and broke her chains. A halo of light encircled these arms, exaggerating Davis's afro hairstyle and depicting her aptly as the liberatory, and as I'll suggest today, gendered icon that she became in Cuban culture. So as most of you know, in 1972, Davis, an activist and professor of philosophy who had previously been fired from her job teaching at UCLA for being a communist, and who had been far from the courthouse the day of the shooting, was acquitted of all charges. Over the next few years, she took multiple trips to Cuba, where several factors facilitated her exaltation. Her demonstrated internationalism and specific support for the Cuban Revolution indicated her participation in an international left politics. Her membership in the Communist Party of the United States facilitated her support from the Cuban state. Yet perhaps more than anything else, Davis's gender played a pivotal role in her reception in Cuba. The Federation of Cuban Women, or FMC, provided an institutional platform for supporting Davis that African-American men visiting or living in Cuba did not share or have access to. Her perceived combination of femininity and toughness endeared Davis to Cuba's public, ensuring her place in a long line of Cuban revolutionary women warriors. And while Davis was at times critical of Cuban gender politics, she was inspired by the revolution and the potential it had for Cuban women and women worldwide. Davis's experiences in Cuba helped shape her thinking about feminism and, in turn, her ongoing work for gender and racial equality in the United States. An expansive view of the women's liberation movement in the 1960s and 1970s includes stories such as the encounter between Davis and revolutionary Cuba. So the relationship between Davis's feminism and the women's movement, much less her experience in Cuba and the movement, has not been fully explored. Scholars such as Benita Roth and Kimberly Springer have shown how Black feminists in the late 1960s formed organizations that institutionalized their long-standing intersectionality that combined racial and gender politics. National organizations such as the Third World Women's Alliance and local groups such as the Harlem Black Women to Free Angela Davis rallied around Davis during her imprisonment and trial and connected her repression with broader issues facing Black women. As was mentioned at a panel yesterday, Black support of Davis became a wedge issue in the women's liberation movement when a prominent now leader asked the Third World Women's Alliance to put down their signs supporting Davis at the 1970 Women's Liberation Day March in New York City. And we can discuss whether race, communism, or other factors motivated this event. But Frances Beale's account of being told that, quote, Angela Davis has nothing to do with women's liberation, end quote, and her response that Davis had, quote, everything to do with the kind of liberation we're talking about, demonstrates the conflicts that arose from linking Davis with women's liberation. While Davis wasn't a member of these groups, her own politics always prioritized both race and gender. Some of her most well-known scholarship has dealt with this intersectionality, including her 1981 classic, Women, Race, and Class. Long before that, while working with groups such as the Black Panther Party and SNCC in Los Angeles in the late 1960s, Davis's consistent emphasis on gender equality was often met with dismissal or hostility. Her frustration led her not to the women's movement, but to the Communist Party, which she joined in the summer of 1968. Davis maintained that it was her identity as a Black woman communist that precipitated the government's actions against her. And these characteristics also drew her to the Cuban Revolution. During the course of her imprisonment and trial, Davis became an international cause célèbre. The National Committee to Free Angela Davis consciously framed her fight as part of a larger struggle of oppressed people. And here's the second most FBI most wanted poster of the panel, Davis on the left, and then one of the many, many, many images put out in the United States of her, saying, "Free Angela and all political prisoners." Groups committed to freeing Davis formed not only in the United States, but around the world, with women's groups taking a particularly active role. So here's a flyer from a Mexican women's group. Cuba played a prominent role in the campaign to free Davis, with Cuban women in central roles. Cuba had denounced Davis's incarceration in 1970, but in June 1971, the Federation of Cuban Women convened a meeting to form a committee devoted to her release. And it involved members from other Cuban government agencies and groups. So the Cuban Committee for the Freedom of Angela Davis, as it became known, sought to condemn Davis's imprisonment in the international community and to raise awareness in Cuba about her situation. The committee initiated a postcard campaign where Cuban students, workers, and the neighborhood associations known as CDRs sent messages of support to Davis in jail in New York. Here's on the upper left corner is the front of the postcard, which I'll come back to the image. And then here are a few postcards that mention her that speak to her as a woman, as a sister, and as an exemplary woman. One of them says, I refer to you in the to form of you rather than the common form, the familiar form rather than the formal form because you're my sister. So the committee's work also helped prompt a steady stream of articles about Davis in the Federation of Cuban Women's Publications, Mujeres and Romances, Songs and poems about her, and ubiquitous images of Davis that rendered her face and naturally styled hair instantly recognizable to Cuban citizens. So, visual culture really solidified Davis's iconic status in Cuban culture. In addition to the poster by Alfredo Roscard described earlier, Felix Beltran, head of the propaganda department for the Cuban Communist Party, made several versions of his iconic 1971 image, Libertad para Angela Davis, or Freedom for Angela Davis, which helped make her image instantly recognizable in Cuba and landed in prominent poster collections around the world. A 1972 article in Cuba magazine cited both Beltran and Roscard's posters of Davis as contributing to the revolution's artistic tradition, and in particular, the pattern of featuring women, including Davis, as integral to the Cuban Revolution. So again, the top left corner is the front of the postcard, but the original image is on the bottom left corner. And then there's a version that ended up in Mujeres on the top right, and then this is a billboard version in Havana in 1971. After her acquittal in 1972, Davis commenced a global speaking tour that included a stop in Cuba. By this time, Davis had been a longstanding supporter of the Cuban Revolution. She had marveled at the Cuban delegation's performance at the 8th World Festival for Youth and Students in Helsinki, Finland in 1962, calling the dance performance that turned into a conga line that went out into the streets, quote, the most impressive event of the festival. In the summer of '69, Davis traveled to Cuba with a Communist Party delegation for the annual July 26th Cuban independence celebration. The group traversed the island and worked in coffee and sugarcane fields as part of the campaign to cut 10 million tons of sugar for the 1970 season. Upon her return in 1972, Davis was treated as a political celebrity. The Cuban state showered her with honors, including in a solemn ceremony with Fidel Castro, the Orden Playa Girón, or Order of the Bay of Pigs, the highest decoration bestowed by the Cuban government. During a trip to Cuba's Isle of Youth, students mobbed Davis, prompting her to abandon her motorcade and lead a parade through the streets in the torrential rain. And here's a kind of mediocre quality image of that from the Cuban daily newspaper, The Granma. Speaking to a crowd estimated at 750,000 people during the events surrounding the 12th anniversary of the Cuban CDRs, an unprecedented Cuban audience for an American speaker, Davis stated that the reception upon her arrival on the island was the warmest and most enthusiastic of any place she had yet traveled, and even referred to Cuba as her true home. Davis's gender offered a crucial institutional platform in Cuba. Specifically, the role of the Federation of Cuban Women as Davis's host provided a structure that African-American men visiting the island just did not have. Long-standing race-based clubs had been disbanded in the early years of the revolution, along with religious organizations and other groups that the state viewed as impeding national unity. The FMC was the only permitted group in the first decades of the revolution whose membership was based on a concept of identity, such as gender, however constructed. The FMC had emerged in 1960 to mobilize women to defend the revolution, elevate their political and cultural consciousness, and improve the conditions of their lives. The organization did not target gender discrimination by men, but capitalism's exploitative practices against women. Created by Castro, the FMC followed a hierarchical structure and had ambiguous political power. Yet its initiatives around women's education, childcare, and health had material and lasting effects on Cuban women's well-being, and with nearly 2 million members and 14,000 employees in the mid-1970s, the organization played a major role in Cuban society, if not an overtly feminist one. Its support of Davis ensured both widespread awareness of her persona and a platform for her to engage with Cuban audiences approved by the highest echelons of the Cuban government. Davis's reception in Cuba also occurred in the context of long-standing veneration for the figure of the revolutionary woman warrior in Cuban society. Historian Lynn Stoner has traced the Cuban trope of militant heroines from the 19th century, where mambisas, women fighters for Cuban independence, risked their lives and those of their family members to obtain freedom from Spain. Nearly 100 years later, women played important roles in the Cuban Revolution. While women such as Vilma Espin, FMC president and wife of Raul Castro, gained prominent positions in the Cuban government, other participants in the rebellion lingered in Cuban culture not as individuals, but as archetypes. Alberto Corda's ubiquitous 1960 photograph of a young, nameless female soldier, miliciana, or militia member, is one such example. The Cuban Revolution's self-representation as a battle for autonomy against the United States, a war without end, necessitated the ongoing valorization of female combatants. Indeed, Stoner asserts that, quote, no other symbol so permeates Cuban nationalist lore than that of the stalwart and feminine combatant, willing to sacrifice her home, family, and wealth for her nation and its patriarchal leaders. Davis's mobilization against the U.S. criminal justice system and her involvement in anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and anti-capitalist struggles qualified her as such a female combatant in Cuba. Cuban conceptions of women accordingly shaped Davis's representation in Cuban discourse. The mambisas of the 19th century and the guerrilleras of the 20th, enshrined in Cuban culture, exuded bravery without sacrificing signs of femininity or roles as mothers and sisters. The Cuban media's emphasis on the, quote, emotional nature of Davis's 1972 visit, and in particular its focus on her interactions with Cuban children, differed from coverage of male visitors. So this is an image also from the Cuban newspaper, La Granma, when Davis visited a daycare center in Havana where children were holding signs of her image. Cubans also took a specific interest in Davis's appearance. One Maudlin article in the Granma described her physique admiringly and at length, discussing her tall and elegant stature, her coloring, and most of all, her naturally styled hair. And her hair is something I talk about more in the larger project. We could talk more about it. Consistent with her intersectional politics, Davis reflected on her time in Cuba through the lenses of both race and gender. Regarding her first trip to the island in 1969, Davis declared that she was immensely impressed by Cuba's efforts to eradicate racism and convinced that, quote, only under socialism could this fight against racism have been so successfully executed. And this isn't a position that everyone I'm looking at shared. She also commented on the militancy of Cuban women, writing admiringly to imprisoned activist and Black Panther Party member George Jackson. After her first trip to the island, Davis described, quote, women patrolling the streets with rifles on their backs, defending the revolution, and young compañeras educating their husbands and lovers, demythologizing machismo. After returning from Cuba in 1972, however, she formed a more critical perspective on Cuban gender politics. At a CPUSA meeting after her trip, she maintained that, quote, we were extremely impressed by the way in which racism is being dealt with on a continual basis in Cuba, and that overall, in comparison to 1969, quote, the path towards socialism had been consolidated. Yet Davis reported that, quote, we did feel that there were substantial problems in the area of women. Davis went on to detail low numbers of women in leadership positions in the revolutionary government and in other sectors of Cuban society. She had brought up the issue of machismo with young men and women in Cuba, recounting friendly debates regarding male supremacy on the island. While Davis did not comment publicly on her gendered reception in Cuba, her report suggested that the revolution had not fulfilled its potential for gender equality. In 1974, Davis returned to Cuba to attend the second conference of the FMC. The Congress occurred amidst a series of events that signaled progress for Cuban women. The February 1975 passage of the Family Code, the largest and most controversial marker of women's rights in 1970s Cuba, mandated equal housework and childcare responsibilities for husbands and wives. Davis registered her belief that socialism lent itself to women's rights and progress in her speech at the Congress, declaring that, quote, "The example of Cuba has confirmed that there cannot be true emancipation for women without a socialist revolution, just as there couldn't be a socialist revolution without the participation and emancipation of the woman." Davis's designation as a President of Honor at the 1974 conference and receipt of the prestigious Anna Betancourt Award, named for a Cuban woman and 19th century independence fighter, underscored her visible identity in Cuba as an internationalist revolutionary committed to women's rights. It also reinforced the kind of anti-imperialist, anti-racist feminism that has marked Davis's activism. Davis's experience in Cuba proved transformative. "The Cuban trip had been a great climax in my life," she wrote in her autobiography in 1974 of her first visit to the island. Davis left Cuba convinced that socialism was conducive to gender and racial equality. Further, the sheer energy of the revolution in the face of US power inspired Davis, who reflected that, quote, "The Cubans' limitless revolutionary enthusiasm had left a permanent mark on my existence." Both the obstacles and progress she saw among Cuban women informed her transnational gender politics. A true internationalist, Davis's encounters in Cuba helped shape her continued feminism in the United States. In turn, for a certain generation of Cubans, Davis has remained a familiar name and face. Thanks.
Okay, so we have about 25 minutes for questions, so the floor is open. Yes. And I'll repeat the question. Oh, there is? Go to the microphone and just at the...
Thank you. It was a wonderful workshop, really informative. I just had a couple of comments. One is for the woman about the Cuban. There used to be, I started a shelter in Hackensack, and I had a poster. I don't know if you have it in your report. It was a green poster, and it said, Angela Davis is welcome here. Maybe it was Assata Shakur. I might have the wrong one. I wondered if you had it. And I'd also like to get a copy of Angela in the March from my daughter. My children are Jabanos, Cuban and Jewish. So if I could. The other is for the woman that spoke about Ericka. I wanted to know if you know anything about, if you remember, I'm probably much older than you, I'm probably much older than everybody, but many years ago when Huey Newton got out of jail, they had a welcoming in Philadelphia, and they were caping him, and everybody was, I came as a supporter, and there were a group of women that were calling themselves radical feminists, and every time they said something about Huey, Brother Huey, he was, wonderful saint God, the radical feminist women were yelling, she, and, I was like, at that time, I was not as radical, I would say, as I later became, but I thought they were terrible. I really did, but now I look at it differently. And the other is, if you have any comment about Elaine Brown, I don't know if she's on the outs, or I met her at my school and I read her book. Thank you.
The first comment about Huey P. Newton, in a larger project, I talk a lot about Huey P. Newton, particularly how progressive on gender he became over time. Elaine Brown talks extensively about how progressive Huey P. Newton, but then this is a very complicated person. So he was struggling with it, but he was more, I would say he was much more progressive, and he was the chief theoretician of the Black Panther Party. He wrote an essay in 1970 about, in support of the women's liberation movement and in the LGBT movement. And so that was a huge moment as well. Now, as far as Elaine Brown, I think her politics around gender is a little bit more complicated. She very much is in support of women as equal comrades in the party. She was chair of the party from 1974 to 1977, very much led the party. However, she does not identify as a feminist. And so those are some stark differences between Ericka Huggins and Elaine Brown, why Elaine Brown does not use the term feminist, because she believes that term is mostly associated with a movement that she does not identify with as a Black woman. Her gender politics are very much progressive. And so, you know, it's very complicated, and that's why I think the term Black Power feminism better situates both of those women that were in the Black Panther Party.
Hi, and thank you all for this really valuable history. I'm Catherine Power, and I lived that history. And I was a revolutionary then, and I want to bridge us to today. None of that has gone away. The determination and the need to transform our society and to be smart about it and to be in coalition about it has not become less. And I just really want to invite everybody here, because I think that this is like this historical moment meeting the present moment, to be aware of the flesh and blood life experience that kept on going of the people from that historical moment, and some of the political insight and activity that it has brought them to today, and I would say including myself. Thank you.
Oh, you're going to the, okay.
Thank you all three for your wonderful presentations. I was just, my question is for, I don't remember your name, the person who talked about Ericka. If you could discuss some of the ways that women in the Black Panther Party had to struggle against patriarchy within the party, so some of the tactics they used and some of the ways that they tried to go around, because I don't think we should say that there wasn't any male dominance in the party. So how did they negotiate that?
They, you know, so as soon as you get to, you know, as soon as, what I argue is as soon as women started getting into the Black Panther Party, they really started talking back, right, challenging different sexist structures that they felt that exist. But also keep in mind that it's very dependent on the chapter or branch you were in, the region, the location. Like, for example, in Detroit's branch of the Black Panther Party, it was mostly composed of women. And so there wasn't the same gender dynamics as it was, you know, for example, in other chapters. And so, you know, when you get the first recruit of, you know, Ericka Lewis, who was the first female recruit of the Black Panther Party, you know, discussions started changing, right? And we get to the period of 1968 and 1969. Many of the men were getting attacked, you know, they were getting killed, they were in exile. I mean, it was various changes going on, and so women were, you know, placed in a lot of these leadership positions. And so, you know, you had everyone that was, things from writing in a newspaper to, you know, on the ground. Elaine Brown, you know, in her leadership when she was on the Central Committee, she put, you know, a lot of women on the Central Committee, and they started advocating for women's issues. But this started actually prior to Elaine Brown's leadership as chair of the Black Panther Party. And there was a lot of internal conversations, like I had mentioned that pamphlet that was distributed that really talked about male chauvinism that was on the ground and that was enacted in different kinds of ways. And, you know, a lot of women in the Black Panther Party, you know, if you didn't have to tolerate it. I mean, you could exist and do, you know, and express your leadership how you wanted to express your leadership. So it wasn't, many women don't look at it as, you know, very repressive in relationship to gender. And so they were not tolerating it when it did happen. But, you know, very quickly in Panther history, you know, it really, the gender politics started to become much more progressive, so, yeah.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and I missed Emily. I'm really sorry I missed Emily's paper because it's great. But I wanted to ask all of you about researching of people who've been underground and the kind of repression, the COINTELPRO repression, and people still, you know, grand juries still being formed to investigate every crime that took place in the 1960s and 70s, and trying to pin it on either whether underground people or Black Liberation Army or Panthers, and many of former Panthers and BLA people still in prison, and Leonard Peltier, of course. So in doing research, how do you do interviews? I know there's been some problems with the Weather Underground work that was discussed here of not access. It's easy to have access, but in my own case, I was underground for 9 months, and even in my own memoir, there are things I can tell about myself, but I implicate others in my group who may not want to be implicated, even in the most minor kinds of things. So could you talk, each of you, a little bit about the complexities of the research you do in this, you know, in this field? Thanks.
Thank you, Roxanne. I think that's a really important question for me because I'm a historian. I'm writing my dissertation about women and violence in the Weather Underground, the Black Panther Party, and also the radical feminists. But especially Weather Underground, it's really hard to research because they don't they don't have any record open to the public, and it's all by the FBI or some memoirs, just only 2 memoirs, one by Kathy Wilkerson and the other one, it was published in 1975 by Susan Stern. So yeah, Bill Ayers, I mean, male members' memoirs are kind of a lot exists, but female members' memoirs are not so much out there. And I think really important to hear unspoken history and the memories. So that's why I'm so grateful to hear from Kathleen Powell about, you know, the history still exists, but it's the past, but at the same time here. So I was going to request something about, I really have I don't have so much social network to connect to Weather Underground especially. So if anybody who knows members in the Weather Underground, please talk to me and give me some information. It'll be very helpful because we need to discover the unspoken history, because especially even the women's members in the Weather Underground, the only stories we know, they're from Bernardine Doran or Kathy Wilkerson, and we don't really know any other members' stories. So I would really appreciate to hear it.
For me, I was able to build a community with Panther scholars very early on in my graduate career. I had a mentor to help guide me through most of my dissertation process, Angela LeBlanc Ernest, and she connected me with other Panther members, Ericka Huggins, and then Ericka Huggins connected me with Elaine Brown, and then, you know, Ron Scott, and so I've interviewed quite a few Panther members from connections that I have built in Detroit, as well as just participating on conferences, which is how I met Angela LeBlanc Ernest. In addition to that, talking with a lot of the Panther members, there was a particular process that I went through in many of my conversations with some of them. There was stuff that was shared with me that they did not want me to write about whatsoever. but it helped, they shared some stories with me to help provide context to the struggle. And so there was a mutual agreement that we both established that that stuff would not be shared. And so I have respected their request with that particular information. And another thing, many of the party members that I talked to, they felt like scholars would contact them, get information, and then they would never hear from them again, or wouldn't share their work with them. And so, you know, I have maintained a relationship with as many party members that I talk to as I can, just to help bridge, you know, that communication between academia and, you know, political activists or scholars, as I call them as well, to keep that connection as well, so we can keep the history alive. So.
Yeah, I think it's a really great and important question. I mean, for my work, well, I guess I've done a few different things, right? You try to look at the government documents, the COINTELPRO, you know, FOIA requests, so that you can try to piece together the government involvement in how events played out. You know, doing oral histories definitely is crucial, and I agree, even just maintaining those relationships. You know, it's hard sometimes, but really important. But I also think, you know, just being I've tried to be very deliberate in my writing about, well, you know, this is represented as what happened, or this is in the public discourse of what happened. And I think acknowledging, you know, that some of the details we may not know for a while or possibly ever. I mean, Angela Davis, you know, there's a lot more writing about her time underground and during her trial than some other people. And especially with Cuba, there's other people I write about who fled as fugitives to Cuba, some of them. Right, so in some ways she's not even the most kind of sensitive case that I'm looking at, but I think there are details about her involvement with the courtroom incident that she hasn't discussed publicly, and so I guess acknowledging where there are those absences, as well as working around how people have perceived it, and doing oral histories as much as possible. But I do think it's challenging and important to kind of acknowledge that. So thanks.
Yes.
She's next. Thanks. Hi. I had a really hard time absorbing everything that was being said, and I really do care about this issue. So about the issue of violence, because I absolutely believe in it. We're being attacked. We need to defend ourselves violently. So I'm very interested in what these women believed in, and also with the resistance they met from the men. And I was just, you know, I heard about the woman from the Weather Underground, but then about people saying, let's fuck her or something, and then she's in the miniskirt, but then that's supposed to be powerful. And then I heard Angela Davis saying, Cuba's good, then it's bad, and I'm just very confused. And I was wondering if somebody could just sum up, in any of these organizations or in Cuba, did they find some feminist oasis?
No. I mean, I think it's always complicated, right? I think, at least in my case, Davis sees a lot of potential, and it convinces her for sure that socialism is perhaps better suited to women's emancipation, but it's not the utopia that she sees. So I think, right, I guess if it's complicated, it's because that's how it went down. And it's always complicated.
Hi, I'm Susan Reberby. I'm a historian at Wellesley College, and I'm working on a biography right now about people who were involved in the Black Liberation Army and the May 19th Communist Organization, and I've had to confront the question Roxanne has just raised. And in fact, when I did a slideshow once, I showed the person I was writing about underground with a blank page. So I think we have to really think about the way history is also a moral endeavor and should never be on the side of helping people who did things, whether we agreed with what they did or not, get arrested, or people get harmed, or movements get slammed. And I think we have to be really careful, and if you need an object lesson of that, think about what just happened with the oral history archives at Boston College, in which someone has now been arrested for murder in Ireland because of what was said in the oral history interview that was then allowed to go forward. So I think we should really, I mean, and it's always hard for me. I'm an activist, longstanding activist, but I'm also a historian, and that tension between wanting to know what happened, right, to write it and to help people understand what happened in the past, and our responsibility to not harm people who did really important things, whether you agree with them or not, is really crucial. And I think, frankly, I would err, my PhD from this place will probably be now revoked, but I think we have to err on the side of maybe not knowing or writing in very general terms about what happened from what we can find out without pushing people. I think it's really dangerous, and we should not be naive about how the historical material can be used. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay,
so
wonderful. Great. Okay, thank you. That was a wonderful panel. I had a question about the politics of appearance and how it operated in each of the organizations and historical moments that you have addressed.
Okay. I think that's, so for the weather women, it's not easy to say they had politics particularly for their fashion, but I believe that they got so much influenced by the Black Panther women especially. And also I remember that one of male members, his name is Jerry Rubin, I think, he got Viet Cong pants from Bernardine Doron when she visited Vietnam. So wearing those pants was kind of making them more empowered. So I think they tried to wear in revolutionary chic way, I would say. So it helped them to represent themselves, especially for women. Although they couldn't wear Afro hair though. They could wear leather jacket, miniskirt, and long boots. So I think that was their political statement as well as gender statement, I think.
Definitely iconography and imagery is really key in looking at Davis in Cuba, and I kind of expand upon it in my larger book project, because I argue that really the images of her, they don't just illustrate this kind of global solidarity, they really constitute the solidarity. And, right, I think I could do a little more with maybe reading the images through a kind of gendered lens, but I think, I'm trying to kind of connect the 3 themes with her in Cuba that have emerged of her gender, her communism, and then her kind of as an image and relate them all together. But definitely they're at the kind of center of what I'm talking about, so thank you.
I would say with the Black Panther Party, their imagery around the dress and the uniform and the afro, it was part of this moment, right, and of the civil rights, Black Power movement, and embracing your blackness. There's this one beautiful YouTube clip of Kathleen Cleaver, I don't know how many people have seen that, doing an interview, and she talks about the afro and how beautiful it is, and she points out white people who are trying to wear afro, and she's like, you dig it? It's beautiful. That's what, and it's just this great archival footage, right, of her, really owning that and talking about the power of that and kind of what it meant as associated with Black Power politics at the time, so.
Yes, last question.
Well, it wasn't really a question, it was more a reflection on what was said before regarding what repression can do with our research and stuff, and what we do with the memory, the testimonies, and I do research on the Tutsi genocide in Rwanda, and I interview victims different violences, including sexual violence, and I think it's very different from that perspective, because the women that I interviewed want to give the names of the men that did the crimes, the committed crimes, the violences against them. And at the same time, so if, you know, courts, whether international or local, use that information, for me, I made the decision that if these women want to use me to convey their version of the story, well, it's okay. And it raises a series of problems, but that's the choice I made. But I decided that since I was using pseudonyms for many of these women, I couldn't go with the request of some women to use their real names, you know? So I think that's depending on the history that we're dealing with. I'm not a historian though, but it has, you know, brings a different power relations. And
does anyone want to make a quick comment, but then we have to...
I think that speaks to the silences, right? Or I should say the protecting certain aspects of the history, right? I've had those requests too, and some stories that were told to me not use the original name or what have you. And I think, you know, many of these, particularly the Black Panther Party members, many of them are still with us, and they live this movement, and this movement is still very much with them, and it's sensitive and it's personal. And so I think part of a scholar's responsibility is try to respect that as much as possible. Yeah.
Great, well, please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you as well.